Hey, Christina from Proverbs 31 Homestead. Today we're going to talk all about canning rabbit. Rabbit has seen a huge resurgence on homesteads, even just in the last year. And a lot of people are curious the best way, other than freezing, which is kind of obvious, to preserve their rabbit meat. Canning is definitely one of those things. Now, I have been canning for a couple of decades now, but I have not canned rabbit before, so this is a big experiment for my family. And so today I am going to take a few rabbits and I'm going to can them all the different ways that are tested safe to can. If you have ever canned chicken before, then this is easy peasy for you because it's exactly the same. So I am going to, with chicken, maybe I have only ever canned raw pack with no added liquid. So I'm going to do that today. We really like chicken that way. I think we're really going to like rabbit that way. But I also wanted to try some bone in, which I have never done before. And I also wanted to try some that is partially cooked and with added stock. So I'm going to do all those things today, show you how to do them all, and then you can test for yourself and see what you like as well. I will say, as I go along, I'm going to explain to you if I think, one method versus another is kind of a pain. But ultimately, it's a taste test, and we all have different ideas about what tastes great or what textures we like. And so you will want to probably do this own experiment on your own. All right, so yesterday I deboned a rabbit, and most of my pieces are about this size, but I have some little pieces too, and that's fine. The big thing is you want to cut it into chunks and that you want to remove the fat. Now, wild rabbit is pretty lean, but domestic rabbit can have quite a bit of fat on it. But fat is always the enemy when you're canning because it will go rancid. I'm going to do pint jars since this is just a test for me, and I put a half a teaspoon of salt. Oops, I didn't do it in that one. I did it in this one though. A half a teaspoon of salt in a pint jar. If I was using quarts, I'd use a teaspoon. And I'm just going to throw the meat in, pack it in nice and tight. I like to use wide mouth jars for that reason. I can get my hand in there. And you're going to use 1-inch headspace. By the way, for this experiment, I cut up 2 rabbits to do raw pack and 2 to do hot pack. These were some smaller rabbits, but this is just to give you, but when I say smaller, they're probably about 4 pounds. I have some rabbits that come in at 5 pounds dressed, which is actually kind of large. But that's just to give you an idea of how much rabbit is going to fill a jar. Your salt it's recommended that you use canning salt. And the reason for that is that cloudy liquid in a canning jar can indicate that the food has gone bad. That won't happen if you use canning salt, but some other salts, if they're iodized, they will end up looking cloudy. And so, especially if you're a beginner, go ahead and use the canning salt, but you can use any non-iodized salt. I would recommend that you use sea salt if you're going to use something other than canning salt. I'm actually kind of surprised how many jars I'm filling. I was sort of thinking that 1 rabbit would fill a quart jar, but we're going to get a bit more than that. So what do you do if you have a jar that doesn't quite get full? Well, you could go ahead and freeze that meat and use it next time you cook rabbit. This case, I'm going to go ahead and can it, and I will use this as my taster tester jar. I'll open it right away. You wouldn't want to store a jar that was only partially full like this in your pantry. Now it's important to get those rims clean. You want to wipe it with a damp cloth. I like to use just a little bit of vinegar because that helps get rid of any fat that might be on the rims. Any little thing on those jar rims can prevent a seal. when I first started pressure canning years ago, I was very frustrated because I was having trouble with jars not sealing. Well, it turned out I just wasn't getting my rims as clean as they could be. When you're pressure canning, a lot of times you are using food that is kind of greasy. By the way, are you finding canning lids in your area? Let me know in the comments. I still am having trouble finding lids. I can find jars with lids on them, of course, but not lids themselves. These are lids that I bought that are Bernardin. I bought them last year online when the shortage started. Okay, fingertip tight. For those of you who don't know what that means, it means you put the ring on until you feel resistance, and then just like a quarter turn more. And in the meantime, I have my pressure canner. Yes, you must use a pressure canner. I have water in it that's starting to get warm. And now I'm just going to stick my jars in. Now, if you do not have a canner that it gets full when you put your jars in, this one might float. That might be a problem. We'll see. You need to make sure that you put enough empty jars or jars filled with water in there so that your canner is full. Otherwise, the food might not get heated all the way through. All right, I'm going to put my lid on. This is by Presto. I find that even though I do love my All-American canner, I use my Presto more often. I find it a little easier to regulate the pressure. So if you pressure canned before, you know that we're going to wait for the pressure to come all the way up and for steam to vent for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I put on the rocker. Okay, now I'm going to move on to getting my hot pack jars ready. For that, you need either chicken or rabbit stock. Either one will work. I use them interchangeably. It doesn't matter at all. It can be store-bought. It can be homemade. If you make your own, make sure that you set it in the refrigerator overnight, and then in the morning or sometime the next day, go ahead and scrape off the fat. Remember, fat is the enemy when you're canning. You might be able to see that there's a little layer of fat here that I didn't scrape off. So I'm going to do that. You don't have to get every tiny little bit, but you definitely want to try to get as much as possible. Now I'm going to reheat this by putting it in a pan. Okay, yesterday I prepared my meat. You're supposed to cook it about 2/3 full is what the National Center for Home Food Preservation says, and I think Ball as well. That's kind of tricky. How do you figure that out? Ideally, the meat should be a little bit pink. I had trouble with that. I went ahead and cooked the rabbit in my Instant Pot. That might have been a mistake. It might have been smarter to boil it, and then maybe I could have cut into the meat and checked it a little more easily. I did, I think, 8 minutes. Yeah, 7 or 8 minutes. And it is, even though it doesn't look pink, it's certainly not cooked all the way through. When I put a whole rabbit in an Instant Pot, I cook it for 45 minutes. That makes it fall off the bone. So that's the rule. You don't want it cooked all the way through or you're going to end up with mush, especially with rabbit. When it's overcooked, it's very mushy. But this is going to go right into that same pan with the stock. And by the way, I did some of the meat, some of the legs bone in and some not, just so I can experiment and see what I like. It is kind of tricky to get all, whoa, I need bigger burners. I need a bigger stove. It is kind of tricky to get all the meat off the front legs, especially, I thought. Back legs weren't so bad. But because you're canning it anyway, and it's gonna, be the consistency of like, I presume, because I've not done it bone in, but it's going to be similar to the consistency of like a really nice canned tuna, like albacore chunks. You don't really have to worry if it's pretty. We're not gourmet chefs here. I've watched them on YouTube straight from Paris showing you how to debone a rabbit, and it's beautiful. Well, yours doesn't have to be that beautiful, thank goodness. Just use a nice sharp knife. Okay, so I'm going to turn the heat on that and warm it up, and then I can pack my warm meat in hot jars. Okay, my rabbit and stock are steaming hot. I've got hot jars. I again put a half a teaspoon of salt in my jar. Again, a quart would be a teaspoon of salt. Salt is optional, by the way, in case I didn't mention that. And I'm gonna leave a 1.5 inch headspace. So there's one with the bone in. I'm going to bubble it. Double check my headspace. It looks pretty good. Gonna wipe the rim with a little vinegar. Put on the lid. And screw down. And then that can go in the canner. So I can see with the pint jars, the only part of the rabbit that you're gonna be able to get bone in is the front leg. Like that. You're not gonna get any other part of the rabbit in there. I would think that even with a quart jar, you're just going to get the legs in. So I would think you would always want to mix some of those bone-in legs with some deboned, because there's still a fair amount of meat in other parts of the rabbit. I will say that I found cooking the rabbit and then deboning it a pain. I thought it was much harder to debone it once it was partially cooked. So as far as the process of preparing the meat goes, raw pack is what I definitely prefer. Okay, bubble it. Double check the headspace and clean the rim. And that can go on the counter. Okay, the processing time is up on the rabbit, so I'm going to turn off the heat. It's important to let that pressure canner come to zero pressure naturally on its own before you do anything else. All right, the pressure is at 0. So I can remove the rocker. And I'm going to let that completely vent and wait 2 more minutes before I remove the lid. And there they are. We let them sit overnight and check the seals, and they're good to go in the pantry. This is the hot pack rabbit and the cold pack. There you have it. That is how you can rabbit, either the super easy way, I think, which would be raw pack, just debone the rabbit and throw it in the jar with a little salt and put it in the canner. Or if you prefer, you can do it with the bone in, partially cooked, or you can debone it after partially cooking it, which I think is a little fussier and it's a little harder to debone the rabbit. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, if you are going to leave the bones in, you're going to have a hard time fitting the whole rabbit in the jar, right? So we can only use pint or quart jars, nothing larger than that. So plan on doing the legs. And if you're using a pint jar, only those front legs are going to fit in with the bone. If you have any questions at all about this or any other canning topics or homesteading topics, please let me know. I will be sure to reply. See you next time. Bye.